Hi there. Today we're going to talk about differences in the development of our sexual anatomy. The last recording was about typical development of the sexual anatomy, and now we're going to talk about some specific instances where that pathway differs. Now, we already know from last time that the binary model of sex, where you're male or female and all the things line up just the way they're supposed to line up, represents the most typical development, right? So this is what we expect to see in the binary model. However, we also know from last time, based on just how complex everything is, that many atypical variations in the development of our sexual anatomy also exist. So, chromosomes may not line up with gonads, may not line up with hormones, may not line up with internal anatomy or genitals or gender identity. So, let's start by talking about, in general, differences in sexual development. By the way, sometimes people refer to these as developmental disorders, but for people who fall into this category, they have a strong preference for differences in sexual development, which, if you think about, makes a lot of sense. Now, when someone's sexual anatomy does not fall into the binary, we refer to them as intersex. What that means is that their reproductive anatomy doesn't fit the typical binary definitions of male or female. And that could be any part of the anatomy, the gonads, the internal anatomy, the external anatomy, anything. Now, it likely occurs in 1 to 2 out of every 100 people, so 1 to 2% of the population. Only those who are born with, quote, ambiguous genitalia are generally detected at birth. We're not looking at anything else. Many are not detected until puberty or when they're trying to have children and for whatever reason cannot. And some of these intersex conditions are never detected, so we actually have no idea how common they are. Now, these differences in sexual development fall into a number of different categories. Some of them are chromosomal. So that means that either the sperm or the egg, or both, carried a different number of sex chromosomes than what we would typically expect. So instead of just one X chromosome, 2 X chromosomes are in that egg or in that sperm. Well, it can't be in the sperm. Or instead of just the one Y chromosome in the sperm, there's an X and a Y. Another category of these differences is called hormonal. So this could be things like low or high levels of one of the hormones that's involved in directing the development of our anatomy, or it could be that the hormones aren't activated, or that the receptors are more or less receptive to the hormone than what is typical. Then there's a third category, which we call cryptogenic or idiopathic. What this really means is that we have no idea what's causing it. We don't know the mechanism. Crypto is like mystery. Genic means to create. And idiopathic means we don't know what the source of it is. So you may hear both of these terms as you're learning about differences in sexual development. So let's start with the chromosomal differences. Now, typically, we would expect to see females with 2 X chromosomes and males with an X and a Y. But all of these different combinations are possible. Some individuals are born with just 1 X chromosome, which means that one of the parental gametes did not deliver a sex chromosome. Some individuals are born with 3 X chromosomes. So mom gave them 2 X chromosomes and dad gave them 1 X chromosome and they ended up with 3. Some individuals are born with 3 X chromosomes and a Y. So both parents' gametes gave them 2 copies of the sex chromosomes instead of just 1. Sometimes we see individuals with 2 X chromosomes and a Y. And sometimes we see individuals with an X chromosome and 2 Y chromosomes. This is just when the cells are lining up to split the chromosomes in half, instead of one going that one way and one to the other, they sort of get stuck together and they both go to one of the daughter cells, one of the eggs or the sperm, and the other one gets nothing. Now, the one thing that we don't see, just in case you're wondering, we never see individuals born without any X chromosome. The X chromosome contains genes that we need for vital functions that are outside of reproduction. So if a cell resulted from sperm and egg and only had a Y chromosome, it wouldn't be able to develop further. It's missing essential recipes. Okay, so here's our first example. This is a chromosomal condition called Turner syndrome. Occurs in about 1 in 2,500 live female births, and these individuals only have an X chromosome. This O here means nothing. So there is no other chromosome. So they have only one X. And what happens in this situation is that the gonads don't mature into ovaries. They're stuck in this embryonic state of just being generic gonads, bipotential gonads. Because they don't mature into ovaries, there is no menstrual cycle at puberty, and this is often when Turner syndrome is detected. Now, estrogen does not determine the development of the internal anatomy, so individuals with Turner syndrome still have a uterus and a vagina. To put it in plain English, they can still have sex in the same way that we would expect. It's just that without ovaries, there are no eggs, there's no menstrual cycle. They cannot become pregnant with their own through their own eggs. They can carry a pregnancy to term through in vitro fertilization, where another egg is used and implanted. Okay, so if we try to use our binary model here, let's see how it goes. They don't have XX or XY, so I don't know where to move that slider. They don't have ovaries or testes, so again, where do I put the slider? Because they're not ovaries or testes, the hormones are, neither one is more abundant than another. They do have a uterus, they do have a vulva and a vagina, and for the most part identify as women. Now, here's another example, Klinefelter syndrome. This occurs in about 1 in 1,000 live male births, and in this case, we have individuals that inherit either 1 or 2 extra X chromosomes. Now, because they have the Y chromosome and the SRY gene, their gonads still become testes, and the testes produce Mullerian inhibiting factor and testosterone. But the extra X chromosomes cause some extra feminization. Often this is not diagnosed at all because body types vary so much in general that, someone with these differences in morphology may not be visible. But if you look at this artist's sketch, you can see that there are slightly wider hips. Sometimes there's some breast development. Often the genitals are a little bit smaller. For whatever reason, they're usually taller than most men. Anyway, that's Klinefelter syndrome. So here we have, again, I don't know where to put the slider for the chromosomes. These individuals have testes, even if they're slightly smaller and produce fewer sperm. They produce testosterone, just less. They don't have a uterus. They do have a penis and scrotum. Again, the size is somewhat smaller than average. And generally they identify as men. Okay, here's another chromosomal situation. So here we have an individual who is XX but male in terms of anatomy. What happens is that when the Y chromosome, so ignore this X chromosome, all right, so we're going to imagine that this X chromosome is in this person's father, next to the Y chromosome. And the Y chromosome says, hey, I got this SRY gene. Do you want it? And the X chromosome is like, yeah, totally. And so that gene moves from the Y chromosome to the X. If the father passes this X chromosome on in his sperm and it combines with another X, even though this person has two X chromosomes, they have the SRY gene, which will cause them to develop as male in terms of internal and external anatomy. This occurs in like 1 in 25,000 live male births. So in this case, we've got XX, but testes, and testosterone, and no uterus, penis scrotum, and generally this person identifies as a boy or man. Okay, here's another situation. Now we're moving into hormonal conditions. So this is called persistent Mullerian duct syndrome. So basically the female ducts are sticking around even when they're not supposed to. We have no idea how common this is. We just know that it happens. These individuals are born with an X and a Y chromosome. However, the testes, for whatever reason, do not secrete Mullerian inhibiting factor. They do secrete testosterone. So, because there's no Mullerian inhibiting factor, which would normally wipe out the female ducts, as we see in this diagram, what happens is that the female ducts continue to exist and develop as well as the male ducts. So these individuals have both male and female internal anatomy. I know one of you out there is asking, wait, what? Do they have a vagina too? Now remember, the vagina, the upper 2/3 of the vagina actually develop with the internal anatomy. So they have the upper 2/3. But the lower third of the vagina, the part that's closest to the external opening, actually develops with the external anatomy. And because these individuals produce testosterone, they are not likely to have a vaginal opening. They have no idea that they have a whole other set of anatomy in their bodies. Everything on the outside looks typically male. Okay, no MIF. I forgot that part. Okay, so these individuals are XY, have testes, produce testosterone, but also have a uterus and a penis and a scrotum, and usually identify as boys or men. Again, not fitting the binary. Now, there's another category of hormonal differences which involve deficiencies in testosterone. Now, I'm actually grouping a number of these together. Some of these are that there's just less testosterone being produced, and some of them it's about the testosterone being converted to the active form. These individuals are born genetically male, but depending on when and how much of the testosterone shows up, that it can be assigned either sex at birth. This picture actually comes from a community in the Dominican Republic where this gene is just more prevalent, this mutation is more prevalent. So in their embryonic development, the testosterone doesn't cause the genitals to become masculinized. It's just not, I think it's not activated in this case. But when they hit puberty, the amount of testosterone suddenly spikes and they go from having female to male genitalia. The name for this in the village is huevedose, which means that you get your eggs or your testes at 12. So these folks, XY, have testes, but something's not typical with the testosterone. They don't have a uterus. Sometimes they have a vulva and identify as a girl woman. Sometimes they produce testosterone or it changes in their lifetime and they develop a penis and identify as a boy or a man. So it changes. All right, here's another one. This is called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Now, androgens are hormones that are masculinizing, so testosterone. So what this says is that these individuals produce testosterone, but their receptors don't care. They don't do anything even when the testosterone is present. This occurs in 1 in 99,000 live births. These individuals are XY. And that means that their gonads actually develop into testes. And their internal anatomy is male. So they have the vas deferens and the epididymis, the testes. But because the testosterone that they produce isn't getting the receptors to do anything, and testosterone primarily directs the external anatomy, it's like having no testosterone at all or very little, and therefore the external anatomy appears female. Now, these individuals typically, if they discover this at all about themselves, discover it when they fail to menstruate or are unable to have children because they lack the internal anatomy for that. In this case, they don't have a uterus, so they can't even carry a child through in vitro fertilization. And the only thing here that must be addressed is that they have to have the testes removed that are in their abdominal cavity, because when the testes are kept at body temperature, they are much more likely to become cancerous. Now, sometimes individuals with this androgen insensitivity have some sensitivity of the receptor. And in that case, it's called incomplete insensitivity. And you might see genitals that are somewhere in between masculine and feminine, because some of the testosterone's working, just not all of it. So, these folks have XY chromosomes, have testes, produce testosterone, but it's not, the body doesn't respond to it. They're not producing estrogen because they don't have ovaries, so I don't know where to put this slider. They don't have a uterus. They do have a vulva. And they generally identify as girls or women, but not always. Okay, another one. This one is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Congenital means with birth. Con means with. Genital or gen is genesis, creation. So with your birth, this condition was already apparent. Adrenal refers to the adrenal glands, and hyperplasia means overactive or overstimulated. So this occurs in 1 in 10,000 to 20,000 live births. These individuals, it doesn't matter what their genetic sex is. They can be XX or XY because the issue is that the adrenal gland is overactive, which we all have. So it produces extra estrogen and extra testosterone. And at birth, the genitalia usually, but not always, appear atypical or ambiguous. The other thing that happens, because these sex hormones are being produced at higher levels even before these individuals reach puberty, is that they show pubertal development early and even hyper-masculinization. So in this image, you see a girl who's probably around 10 or 11 years old, but she has an enormous amount of pubic hair, which generally doesn't show up like that early, and her genitals have an appearance somewhere between masculine and feminine, or somewhere between the extremes. So here we can be XX or XY. If we're XX and we have ovaries and we're producing estrogen, but we're also producing a lot of testosterone. We have a uterus, but also perhaps some more masculinized version of the genitals. And the identity for this individual might be girl, woman. But these sliders can be in different places for each individual. All right, last category of these differences is what we call cryptogenic idiopathic. We don't know how it happened, but these things happen. So there's something called uterus didelphys, which is where the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina are duplicated. So there's two sets of the internal female anatomy. There's also something known as vaginal atresia, where there is a vagina, but that outer third of the vagina doesn't develop properly, and so there's no vaginal opening. Mullerian agenesis. Agenesis means failure to be produced or failure to generate. So here, the uterus and the upper vagina are missing. Hypospadias, which are actually quite common, is when the urethral opening that usually comes out at the tip of the penis comes out somewhere else along the shaft or even in the scrotum. This is corrected surgically so that urination's not an issue. We also have individuals that have diphallia, which means they are born with two penises. When you think about how complicated it must be for our cells to read all these cookbooks and make all these recipes and, follow the instructions perfectly, it makes sense that there are differences in our development. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the response or the treatment. So when someone is born and identified as intersex, which means that their genitalia have been considered ambiguous or undifferentiated, unclear. Historically, doctors and parents decided on the sex or the gender. Oh, let's look at it. It looks closer to a girl than a boy, so let's go girl. Or it looks closer to a boy than a girl, so let's go boy. They would just make a decision based on what seemed closest. And then they would give the infant surgery to try to get their genitals to look right, would treat them with hormones to create the masculinization or feminization that was somehow ideal. And the message that the child got, if they knew anything about this, was that their genitals were not okay. They needed to be fixed. And they would often choose a gender like the easiest one for us to get to, as opposed to knowing what the child's actual gender was. These surgeries often produced pain and loss of genital sensation, which meant that they were not able to enjoy any sort of sexual pleasure as much as you would otherwise expect later on in life. And one of many issues is that as an infant or a young child, they can't consent. And in many cases we're not even told that their genitals were different and this is what we're doing. It was kept a secret from them. Now, nowadays, the response, the treatment is very different, in large part because intersex individuals came forward and said, hey, that was horrible what you did to me. You told me that I was born wrong and you tried to fix me and you took away things that were mine and you didn't ask. So now the United Nations and the World Health Organization forbid non-essential surgery in order to produce a normal appearance without the informed consent of the patient. That means you have to wait until this person is able to consent for themselves. And in today's time, more and more intersex individuals are opting not to have surgery. Why would I want to change my genitals so that they look like what you expect? And in the course of this treatment, lose the ability to feel the pleasurable sensations that my genitals give me. So, our reproductive anatomy is as individual as our fingerprints. It's clear that the binary model does not fit the reality of how our anatomy actually develops, and we need something better and more accurate. Now, thank you, scientists, biologists, for coming up with this. Not that this is something you can easily explain to a 4-year-old, and probably you can't even see it clearly in this slide, but what I want you to notice is that we've got various options for chromosomes here. We've got various options for gonads, various options for hormones, various options for internal and external anatomy, and even gender. So what that means is that instead of choosing male or female, and those are the only options, that this is a way of describing each individual's unique biological sex. So they can be here and then over here, or they can go down this line and connect over here. There are lots of options. I'm going to try to get a bigger version of this so that I can post it on our Google Classroom site and you can see more of the details. But this is a more accurate model of how our biological sex works. Okay, so knowing all of this, how do we determine a person's sex? Do we look at their genetic sex? And if so, what about the other options? Do we look at their external anatomy, the vulva, penis, and scrotum? What if their genitals aren't clearly one or the other? Do we look at their internal anatomy, their ovaries, testes, uterus, vas deferens? How are we even supposed to check for those accurately? Do we look at their gametes? Do they produce sperm or eggs? That's awkward and a bit invasive, especially if you're talking about a baby. And what if none of these things match perfectly? Then what do we do with our binary model? And why is this so complicated? Right? The problem in our society and many societies around the world is that even though biological sex is complicated, we keep trying to use a model that is too simple to be able to explain how things really work. And yet, even though it doesn't fit, we are obsessed with it. Everything, when a couple is pregnant or a woman's pregnant and the baby's going to be arriving or does arrive, is about, is it a boy or a girl? Now, this model causes real harm because anyone that doesn't fit the model of the typical male or female is made to feel ashamed of their bodies. And we're going to talk more about what this does to our development. People dissociate, there is trauma, but you don't have a choice about your body. And when society says it's wrong, it causes deep, deep pain and trauma. So let's come back to this question. Why do we need to know? Why do we need to determine our biological sex? Is it so that we can identify each other? I mean, be able to tell whether we're male or female? Is that important for some reason? Is it so that we know which bathroom people need to use? I mean, we all just need toilets, right? Is it so that we know what sports we're allowed to play? Or who we're allowed to marry? Or what clothes we're allowed to wear? None of these things are important. The only reason that we need to know a person's biological sex is so that we can interpret certain medical tests, so that we can design certain surgeries, and so that we can give appropriate medications and doses. Otherwise, it's really that person's business, and it shouldn't influence anything. Our society's obsession with it makes no sense. Imagine that instead of having this check a box for male or female, our biological sex were put together as a set of descriptors. So you wouldn't say I'm male, you would say I have 46 chromosomes, an X and a Y. I produce this much testosterone, appear male on the outside, testes have descended, vas deferens and prostate are present, sperm production normal range. But anyone that didn't fall into this category would have the specifics there, which would actually allow their medical providers to have more precise and accurate responses. What if the birth certificate or the baby announcements didn't say it's a boy or a girl and just said it's a baby? It doesn't have to be on the birth certificate. And what if we stopped using terms like normal when what we're really describing is what is typical or usual or most common? What if we stopped saying undeveloped, defective, abnormal, or disorder when we're describing things that are really examples of diversity, difference, variation, or just conditions, categories of development? And what if people stopped saying things like mistake, weird, freakish, disgusting, gross, or ugly to describe things that they don't expect? And what if we corrected others when we heard that? It'd be a much nicer world. What if we didn't bother with these labels at all and simply enjoyed our bodies as they are and expressing ourselves as we feel? So ask yourself, occasional medical problems aside, is there anything actually wrong with being intersex? What matters more, the way our genitals look, or how they function or make us feel, or who we are in the world? Should anyone be made to feel shame about their sexual anatomy, the stuff they're born with, that they have no control over? And why do we treat differences in the reproductive system more harshly than in other systems? Finally, ask yourself, do we choose who we like based on their reproductive anatomy? Do our friends choose us because of ours? I mean, honestly, ask yourself, how many of your friends' genitals have you actually seen? Do you even know? And what are the valuable things about lasting friendships and relationships based on? Is it really our genitals, or is it a lot of other deeper, important stuff? Now, I want to go back to two things here. I talked a little bit about this already, but about treating intersex. Treating intersex differences is really a surgical solution to a social problem, not a physical problem. So historically, intersex babies had surgery to correct their genitals. They were for cosmetic reasons and had risks that far exceeded any benefits, if there were any at all. They generally chose to do the surgeries to make the individual appear female because it was easier to make a hole than a pole. And the gender identity and wishes of the individual who was born intersex weren't considered at all because they were infants. And in many cases, this was withheld from the individuals. So I want to share a story here. Someone named Ruth, who's now 60, and was born intersex. Ruth spent most of her youth questioning the constant medical attention, including surgeries she received in her early childhood in the 1960s. Quote, "Doctors always deflected my questions and stonewalled me when I asked why I had so many appointments," she said. "I developed PTSD and dissociative states to protect myself while they treated me like a lab rat, semi-annually putting me in a room full of white-coated male doctors, some of whom took photos of me when I was naked." Ruth attended a private university, started a lucrative career, and got married to a man. Then one night, when she was 32, she hemorrhaged while having sex, so she rushed to the hospital. What she said was that after my vaginal repair surgery, I had my first encounter with a truly compassionate and candid doctor. He told me, "I'm not sure what you have, but if I can see your medical records, I can explain it to you." Ruth drove to the office of the endocrinologist who had treated her throughout her childhood and requested her records. He said no, so she waited in the parking lot until he left that night. She broke in and stole them. She says, "I sat in the parking lot and didn't even read them at first. I put them in date order. Then I took a breath and I started reading, and the first thing I saw on the first page was male pseudohermaphrodite, complete female phenotype. Patient does not know." And these thoughts rushed through her mind. First, I thought, this is great. It's a known thing. How freaky does it make you feel when they say there's no one else like you and no name for your condition? The second thing she thought was, these fucking bastards lied to me all the time. There are other people out there like me. I was totally enraged that it had been kept from me. Why would you deliberately try to make a person feel like a freak? And then I felt, this feels good. I've got the knowledge and they can't hide it from me. I can protect myself now. And then I thought, I wonder how much Mom knows. Did she know this and was part of it, a keep it from Ruth thing? Ruth confronted her endocrinologist the next day. He said her mother had asked him not to tell her and that he was just following the standards of care. And Ruth said, that was when I realized that the way I was treated was never about me. It was about my doctor and my parents and everybody feeling uncomfortable with how my body was. But all I wanted was to be the way that nature made me. Right? Consider that. Now, I want to present one other thing for you to think about that we will be talking about, and that is a case study on the importance of biological sex, in this case in athletics. So, in 1992, the International Olympic Committee came up with a system for determining sex, and they said that athletes with an SRY gene were not allowed to participate as females. Specifically, there were 8 female participants who were found to have the SRY gene. However, further investigation indicated that all of these athletes had developed as fully female, and they were eventually allowed to compete. These athletes were found to have either partial or full androgen insensitivity, one of the things that we talked about, despite the fact that they had an SRY gene. Now, in the late 1990s, a number of relevant professional societies in the U.S. called for the elimination of gender verification, including the American Medical Association, stating that the method used was uncertain and ineffective. They eliminated chromosomal screening, XXXY, at the 2000 Summer Olympics, but they're still testing based on hormones. So, I want you to know that there are differences between men and women, the typical development of our bodies. For instance, in this graph, you can see this is the height in centimeters. Women tend to be shorter. Okay, we fall lower on this axis. The reason this green spike is taller is because there's a smaller range of women, so we fit into a narrow category. Men tend to be slightly taller. NBA players tend to be way taller, right? But if you look at women and men, there's a lot of overlap here in terms of height, right? If you look here, this is measuring strength at various ages of men. Those are the black dots, and women, those are the white dots. And what you can see here is that there's way more overlap than there is difference. So I ask you, why do we organize athletic competitions by sex? What assumptions are we making about the differences between men and women, and are those assumptions correct? And if we're separating athletes by sex, what method do we use to determine conclusively what someone's sex is? And what do we do with athletes who are intersex or transgender? Finally, are there other ways we might organize athletic competitions to be fair to all athletes? Could we maybe base it on our strength, or how much oxygen our lungs can hold, or how much we weigh instead of what our genitals look like?